In just 4 days, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present her first budget, the first of the Modi government in its second term. Over this week, we will take you through the challenges and expectations from the Finance Minister ahead of a budget that is going to be a tough balancing act. Today, we debate the question of fiscal consolidation versus growth. Essentially, should the Finance Minister focus on a stimulus package that will boost an economy facing a slowdown, even if it comes at the cost of breaching our own fiscal deficit target of 3.4% of the GDP? This debate comes in the light of two very crucial pieces of news today. GST revenues have dropped to below 1 lakh crore rupees after holding steady above this figure for 3 months. And a CMI report has projected that investments in new projects have plunged to a 15-year low in the quarter ending June 2019. So where should the focus be? To speak on this today, I am joined by Dr. Hasib Drabu, former Finance Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Rajat Khaturiya of ICRIER, and Anant Narayan, Professor S.P. Jain, Institute of Management and Research. Welcome all. Dr. Drabu, let me begin by asking you the very simple, basic question, because we see this debate before every budget. Is it a very pertinent one this time? There is a school of thought which says ditch the 3.4% fiscal deficit target, go for growth.
Well, I think to some extent this is this either or doesn't work, but largely we have followed a certain pattern in our fiscal stance and fiscal management. But given the situation today, in terms of the fact of slowing down of growth, the lack of investment demand, and so on and so forth, I think there should be no discussion on this, that this has to be a growth-oriented budget. But that doesn't mean that it should be a fiscally irresponsible budget. Now, this headline number of fiscal deficit that everybody bandies about, of 3.5%, one needs to look at the composition of this fiscal deficit. Now, if this fiscal deficit is let to go 100 basis points more than what it currently is, but that is entirely geared towards capital expenditures, reviving investment demand, then I don't think that there will be a macroeconomic problem. So, what one is really saying that don't just look at fiscal deficit, look at fiscal deficit as being built up of revenue deficit and capital expenditure. There are the two components relevant for our discussion here. I would look at a budget that actually keeps revenue deficit in check and allows capital expenditures to breach the levels that it currently has. You can still stay within the overall expenditure to GDP ratio of today. It's around 12.7. Maybe take it to 13.2, 13.3, and the incremental thing goes into capital expenditure. Now, we must also recognize that post GST, these budgets, the union budget is now really an expenditure budget. And what we are talking of today is more about public expenditure policy than about fiscal policy. So, the composition of public investment, public expenditure needs to be changed, aligned more towards public investment than public expenditure. There will be challenges with that, and we can discuss these as we go along. But my basic point to the simple question you ask is that yes, it has to be a growth-oriented budget without being fiscally reckless. It can be managed by altering the composition of fiscal deficit.
Let me take that question to Rajat Khaturiya, and of course, this is in the light of a number of brokerage houses have also, been forecasting or perhaps talking about what they hope to see. So markets hope to see some kind of a bigger push on growth. Some predict that, pushing the fiscal deficit to 3.6, 3.8 is not going to be a big deal beyond a point, won't affect India's sovereign ratings. But right now, the focus needs to be on growth. Do you agree with that point of view?
Yes, Tamanna, I do agree. And in fact, I agree with every bit that Hasib Drabu has just said, that given the situation we are in, we need to grow much more rapidly, because growth will provide us the stimulus to jobs, growth will provide us the stimulus for poverty alleviation. So growth is absolutely necessary. And we are not saying here, be growth obsessive. We are not talking about 10% growth or, double-digit growth. We are talking about growth that we had come to expect for a country like India, 7%, 7.5%. And even that is not being realized if you look at the numbers recently. So I think there has to be a push for growth. And whether it will upset the fiscal balance or not, I think one has to look at fiscal consolidation not just year by year, given that it's so difficult to achieve fiscal consolidation in India, given our subsidies and given our other expenditures. So we should look at fiscal consolidation over a period of time. And I think nobody will deny India the benefit of doubt that we are moving to a situation where we are going to achieve fiscal consolidation over a period of time. And the matter of discussion should be, how are we going to achieve that fiscal consolidation? One is, of course, we're going to shore up our revenues. Hopefully our tax to GDP ratio will go up over a period of time as soon as GST stabilizes and we get more people in the tax net. On the expenditure side, I think Hasib Drabu, who himself has been finance minister of a state, he's got it absolutely right. And we've said this in the past before, that we need to expand our fiscal deficit, and we can expand it, but provided we expand it productively and we don't waste it on revenue expenditure, and we don't splurge it on subsidies which are not going to give us returns in the future. So even if we are able to, let's say, breach that self-imposed deficit number by a few basis points, I think in the interest of growth we should do it. And we are at a point in our history where I think it is India's chance to take off, and we should not let go of this opportunity at any cost. We don't want countries like Vietnam, Cambodia and Indonesia to steal a march on us, because if you look at the history, it was Japan, it was Korea, it was China, and this is our opportunity. And I don't think we should forego of this opportunity and focus. We should focus on investment, focus on growth, and even if we breach the fiscal deficit by a few percentage points, given what Hasib has just said and given what I have just said, we should do it.
Okay, let me get Anant in. Rajat Kathuria says that even if we breach the fiscal deficit by a few percentage points or a few basis points, actually, it's okay for now. And look at the kind of data coming in as well. Rajat Kathuria spoke about GST revenues. We've seen a dip after 3 months of GST revenues staying solid above the 1 lakh crore rupee mark. The CMI report talks about private new investments down to a 15-year low. Is it time to push that button and say, okay, let that 3.4% be for now, Anant?
Well, Tamanna, to start with, I think that 3.4% has gone long time back. For the last fiscal year, FY19, while the government headline number is that we maintain fiscal deficit at 3.4%, the real number, if you look past the accounting mechanisms being used, is well higher than that. The principal reason for that is there was a significant slowdown in the tax collections, particularly in GST and indirect tax collections, and that led to a shortfall of about 1.66 lakh crores, close to 0.9% of GDP. Now, how the government has still managed to maintain 3.4% of fiscal deficit despite this shortfall in revenues is it has essentially pushed out certain expenses off balance sheet. So Food Corporation of India now has a debt of 1.96 lakh crores. A substantial part, if not all of it, looks like expenses which ought to be paid by the government as food subsidy to the Food Corporation of India, which is instead not being paid out. And because the government follows cash accounting, if you don't pay an expense, it's not accounted for. Long story short, we've already bust the fisc. And unfortunately, because of revenue collections being on the lower side, what's happened is that our revenue deficit has gone up, and it's not the capital deficit or capital spending which has gone up. Now, here is where we are. Despite what purists might say on the fiscal front, the reality is this is the best time we probably have had in many, many years to be a little adventurous on the fiscal side. And the reason for that is the global context is very, very conducive. Global growth is down. The central banks globally are talking about rate cuts. Every government is actually trying to do some fiscal spending. So it's not going to be a big deal if we actually press the accelerator a bit on the fiscal side, along with the monetary loosening, which is already happening. But it does come with risks, and we have to be cognizant of that. First, I completely agree with Mr. Drabu Dr. Drabu, that we have to focus on capital spending and not on revenue expenditure. We have to be austere on revenue expenditure, push the money into fresh investments, into roads, ports, water, irrigation, all of that. Second, normally when we have fiscal and monetary easing happening together, there are risks which come on the external front because it pushes up imports, it pushes up our current account, and that can make us vulnerable to financial instability. And we have to be conscious of that. Last bit, we talk about fiscal and monetary so much. The real reforms required for us to grow are beyond fiscal and monetary. It is land reforms, labor reforms, capital reforms, banking reforms, power sector reforms. These are real hard reforms which have to be done. In all this noise of trying to focus on fiscal and monetary, we can't lose sight of these real issues. Look, the economy is hurting as of now, and unfortunately, the time for reform is well past. The earlier we get back to the reform path, the better for us.
This is an open debate, so if anyone has a point to come in, please do. But let me come to you, Dr. Drabu, on what Anant Narayan just hinted at, which was off-budget accounting, which he reckons has actually taken the fiscal deficit to beyond 3.4%. We know a bit of window dressing always happens, but do you think this is a point where we need to take a close, hard look at what the true picture is before we decide to sort of push growth at the cost of fiscal deficit, if that's the choice?
Well, I mean, these, as you said, I mean, these adjustments, as they are called in budgetary parlance, is now very much a part of it. So, if you go back in time, even as early as I remember in the 1990s, the oil pool account was used to buffer up the fiscal deficit numbers. So, in some ways, if you were to adjust for it, the headline numbers are 3.5, but you probably are looking at 3.7, 3.8 as it is. But we are more worried about the trend, not so much about the specific of a particular number. But broadly, the consensus, as I can see, is that one must look at public spending to engender growth. The reason for this is very simple, because today there's a complete collapse of investment demand. Even as consumption demand has held the growth to whatever levels it currently is, there is a lack of investment demand, and public investment is the only one that can trigger off a growth story in India right now, and not so much the private investments. I think that's a fact that you should recognize. Now, some of this also is because of the changes that have happened in the economy. I'm pretty sure that GST, once it stabilizes, will give you enough flexibility. The real problem that today the finance minister will have is in the previous one, the last budget of Mr. Jaitley. He did kind of make some announcements which will have to be funded now, so there will be limited flexibility. But the fact remains that you are seeing some changes like the IBC and others, which have really dampened the corporate investment appetite today. And you are seeing that there's no fresh investment happening. So this is the time when the public expenditure mix has to change. Unfortunately, last budget perhaps skewed the balance by moving back to revenue expenditure through poverty alleviation programs. So you would see that capex even in the government sector has dropped. So one should kind of go back to a cycle where, at least for the next 2 to 3 years, and the real compulsion, because I don't think the finance minister has much of a choice now in terms of funding growth, because right from the president in his address and endorsed by the prime minister in the parliament, this whole 5 trillion by 2023-24 is a growth target, right? So you need to work backwards from that. What I would recommend right now, I mean, it would be interesting to see, and it might be a trend to follow, is to work out rolling budgets to see how you can arrive at the 5 trillion target. It's not a number that's been pulled out of nowhere. I'm sure there's some thinking going that's gone into it, and the finance minister will have to take cognizance of this, which will actually set you the growth target the next 5 budgets that she has to follow. So she should start working backwards to see what the expenditure commitments are. Now, as I said earlier also, the union budgets now are expenditure budgets. They're not revenue budgets anymore. GST Council decides indirect taxes, you don't pay indirect taxes so much. So you need to work backwards to see how, at what level would you want to peg the expenditure to GDP ratio, and then start funding it from wherever your sources of revenue receipts are, and look at a little more closely, more than the level, the composition of it, and you will not have this either or debate that you are, or the either or dilemma that you are faced with right now.
No, absolutely. I think what feeds into the either or dilemma is also the kind of promises we've seen in the interim budget. And then let's look at that. The very ambitious welfare schemes that this government has projected and will continue to work on. And let me come to Mr. Kathuria on that. So PM Kisan is one of those schemes. Of course, Ayushman Bharat is another scheme. We could expect a bigger rural boost than just the extension and the expansion of PM Kisan that we've seen. There are no signs really that the government would, close its fist on these welfare schemes.
No, I don't think it's a possibility to slow down on the welfare schemes, given that farm distress is a reality and agriculture has actually slumped in the last few months. So I don't think and agriculture is, contributes to over 40% of our employment. So I don't think there'll be a slowdown on the welfare schemes, and these will continue. The point is really, where is the money going to come from to spur this growth, the investment, especially private sector investment. And I think the only way, and one is, of course, we are talking about the rate cuts, and the rate cuts are happening in the rest of the world as well. And I think we are also going to see an easing of the interest rate cycle over a period of time. So that might provide a certain boost for investment. But as we know, that investment responds to many more things than just the interest rate cuts. And then, of course, there's a transmission cycle. But there are so many other handicaps that you can't immediately expect that the investment cycle will begin or will kick off. So the only opportunity at this point is for the government to actually be able to find the investment to fund public sector projects or public investment projects like roads, ports, etc., so that they can crowd in private investment. I think that's the best bet for this government, and begin investing in those projects. There's a dilemma, of course, public policy is never made in a vacuum. Of course, there are many trade-offs. And one of the big trade-offs that we face today is that when the government has promised that it is going to reduce the tax rates, or it's done it for small and medium enterprises, but it's going to try and make India competitive with the rest of the world in taxes, where countries like the United States are cutting taxes, and where we, if you believe the OECD report that has just come out a few days ago, that report suggests that India is one of the most taxed nations in the world. The corporate tax rate is almost touching 40%, given all the other levies and I think so. There will be pressure on the government, if they were to become competitive, to try and reduce the tax rates, direct tax rates on corporation. But I think this is not a time when they will try and do it, because given the fiscal situation of the government. But in the course of this government's tenure, we will probably see a reduction in the tax rates, or they might just, in this budget, increase the threshold to which the 25% tax rate applies. So you'll see maybe the definition of MSMEs will go up from 250 crores to maybe a higher threshold. So that's one way they could do it. But overall, I think we'll have to look at a situation where the government reduces the overall tax rates for the economy, so that firms are then able to reinvest a lot of their earnings. At the moment, of course, profits are low, and therefore cash flows or reinvestments are pretty less, and private investment is not taking off. So all in all, I think it has to be investment driven by the government to crowd in private investment. Welfare schemes are likely to continue, given the farm distress that we've seen in the last few months, and given that agriculture still supports over 40% of the people. I don't think there will be a let go or easing on the pedal on the welfare schemes for rural India.
Okay, so then what are the options available to the government to sort of balance the budget? Anand, you want to come in? There is a steep divestment target of 90,000 crore rupees, which was announced in the interim budget. Do you think that will require a relook, or is the time better now than before to look at actually some realization of these divestment targets?
Well, even the last year's target, Tamanna, for disinvestment was finally met the way it's been met several times in the past by left hand, right hand kind of HPCL, ONGC transactions. Yes, I do think there is opportunity, particularly through the exchange traded funds (ETFs) that the government is launching, to do more disinvestment this time. Hopefully, every single cent which comes out of disinvestment will go into fresh capital investment, and God knows we need fresh capital investments. But I don't envy Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's shoes at all at this point in time. It's tough to be in her shoes. Look, the extent of fiscal slippage which has gone through already is not 0.2, 0.3% of GDP. It's far higher than that. FCI, as I mentioned, alone is 1.96 lakh crores. That's over 1 or close to 1% of GDP for this fiscal year. Government has issued government service bonds on behalf of several entities, which is close to 90,000 crores. Distribution companies of power companies of power, state government exposures are now back to pre-Uday levels of 2.6 lakh crores. All this accumulates to over 2.5% of GDP between center and state. So we've already seen a fair amount of slippage on the fiscal front, largely because of a reduction in revenues because of this GST implementation. I think the silver linings are the following. One is hopefully GST will improve going forward. Last month's number was a disappointment, but I do agree that with this reform coming through long term, we should see tax to GDP numbers going up. And every time we've managed to control the fisc in a sustainable manner has been because of growth in revenues and actual growth rather than by contracting our expenditure, which is really tough to do. Second thing is, there are low-hanging fruits as far as reform is concerned. Now, these are tough reforms to do, but the upside of such reforms, as far as our economy is concerned, can be pretty large. Now, the government in the previous avatar in 2014, 15, 16 did try some of it, land reforms, labor reforms. Why is it that textile companies and ready-made garment companies are closing down in Tirupur and opening in Dhaka instead? And a lot of it is to do with land and labor reforms. Now, so far, it's been tough to do those, and the impulse to do those has been low. Hopefully, given the current situation and given the enormous amount of political capital that this new government has, some of these real reforms can go through. Likewise, with banking reforms, PJ and I came out with this report in 2014. It's now gathering dust, but the need for reform hasn't really gone away. So I'm hopeful that, look, the conditions aren't great right now. NBFCs have kind of clamped down so therefore 25% of the financial services ecosystem is not lending. Banks are struggling to fill in that breach. Growth is therefore coming down. Consumption growth, not just for autos, but across consumer durables as well as FMCGs seems to be coming down. It's not a great mix, but I'm still hopeful that with the right policy mix, with the right reforms, even if we do slip on the fiscal side, if we cut down on revenue expenditures, push money into productive capital investments like irrigation, ports, roads, water management, and so on and so forth, education, hopefully we will meet that target of getting to a 5 trillion economy over time. It'll be really hard work though. There is no real magic mantras available at this point in time.
No, absolutely. So, and I get the point that Dr. Drabu made, that if you've said $5 trillion economy in the House of the Parliament, it's not a figure from thin air. Is now the time to push for it? Because right now seems like you sort of need to not press the panic button, but you need to start taking a very close, hard look at the slowdown that we're all talking about. In your view, what are the top priorities that the finance minister can look at, the 1, 2 or 3 things that you would hope to see? Yes, Dr. Drabu?
Are you asking me, Tamanna?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. All right, first up, certainly we need to do a hard look at the GST numbers. I mean, not just in terms of revenues, but the rate and the band change are very critical. I think that should be top of the agenda. Immediately after the budget, there should be an exercise, probably move a number of items onto the 12 and 18 band, look at a 14% band, which is like, you do a 3 rates structure now. We have had enough experience on this front. I think that's a major one which would ensure some degree of relief. Reverse charge mechanism, which will widen the base. Those would be the 2 top agenda items that I would put on the GST. I would look very, very closely at the banking sector. I mean, I think there's a huge requirement, because if you want banks to lend, then they must have capital requirements. Capital requirements come out of the budget. Last time also, the finance minister had made provisions for capitalization of the banks. I think that's a big item that needs to be looked at, is in terms of what is happening with the financial sector. Third, of course, is tightening up of the corporate sector is reeling under this whole issue of IBC. Everything is stuck up there. Not a single issue is getting resolved. So you would need to look at that. Those three things would be my top of the list, particularly the GST and the banking sector, which if you want growth to be fueled beyond the first round of public investment, it has to be funded through the banking sector. If you want your divestments to improve, it must have a vibrant capital market, which is not going to be vibrant unless there is growth. So it's all contingent upon that. These are different elements of it by which you can ensure sustainable growth. I would focus on that, going beyond the public expenditure, because that's the first round. So going beyond the budget, I think GST and banking sector, particularly was mentioned about the NBFC sector, a large chunk is now missing, and you need financing of growth, and that number, if it's 5 trillion in 5 years, one must have a rolling plan to see where this money is going to come from. We need to go back to basic macroeconomics. What is the savings rate that this economy is now looking at? That has come down sharply. That needs to be bumped up a little, otherwise your current account deficit will widen, and you will convert an internal fiscal imbalance into an external imbalance issue, and that will put further constraints on growth. So it has to be a well-rounded exercise, not just in expenditure policy, but in macroeconomic policy, which includes fiscal, expenditure, monetary and reforms within the tax regime as well as the banking sector.
Okay, so high expectations there from Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's maiden budget. We'll be keeping our eyes on that, and of course all this week on the India Development Debate, we're discussing different facets of the challenge she faces to present a truly balanced budget. I want to thank all of you for joining us today on the show, and before we sign off, one more head that the Finance Minister may have to think of when looking at doling out funds in the budget is for the Jal Shakti Abhiyan, which was launched today formally by the newly instated Jal Shakti Ministry. It has pinned its target on water conservation and bringing piped water to every household by 2030. It's going to be a tough ask. The social media angle of it is also interesting. As you all know, all of our viewers who've been with us, that we've been tracking the water crisis diligently here on the India Development Debate. We're glad that the government has gotten to the act as well. In fact, the Prime Minister's office lauding instances of individual water warriors doing their bit today. Some of those examples on your screen. You come in as well and tell us what you think and where you have seen some true efforts to solve India's water crisis. That's all the time we have this evening on the India Development Debate. Thank you for joining us.